They thought no one would stop them. In a snowbound Montana diner off-duty, cops laughed as they humiliated a young waitress until one of them crossed a line and poured hot coffee on her shaking hands. The room went silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Then the door opened. A 45-year-old man stepped in from the storm, wearing a worn leather jacket, a gray scarf, and a look forged by war. Beside him stood a silent German shepherd watching everything. They didn't know who he was, but before the night ended, everything would change. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Snow swept across the Montana highway in long, blinding sheets, wrapping the lonely diner in cold wind and pale yellow light. The diner had stood there for decades, a low rectangular building of faded siding and fogged windows, surviving more winters than anyone could count. Inside, the air smelled of grease-burnt coffee and old vinyl booths warmed by years of bodies coming and going. For Sarah Mitchell, this place was not nostalgia. It was survival. At 26, she was slim and slightly stooped from long shifts, with light brown hair pulled into a tight ponytail that never quite hid the faint scar near her temple. Her skin was pale, marked by sleepless nights, and her eyes carried a cautious alertness that came from learning too early how quickly kindness could turn into cruelty. She worked the night shift because it paid a little more, because fewer people asked questions, and because it kept her moving forward after leaving a relationship that had taught her fear in quiet, intimate ways. Sarah moved between tables with practiced efficiency. Shoulders tense, smile, polite, but restrained. Every clink of a mug, every scrape of a chair against the floor made her flinch just slightly. She had learned to read rooms the way others read weather-sensing pressure before the storm arrived. Tonight, the storm came with laughter. The door swung open hard enough to rattle the glass. Cold air rushed in, followed by 4 men in dark jackets dusted with snow. They were off-duty cops, their badges hidden, but their confidence unmistakable. At the front was Officer Brian Holt, 38, broad-shouldered, with a thick neck and a face hardened by years of authority that had gone unquestioned. His hair was cropped short, his jaw shadowed with stubble, and his smile carried an edge that never quite reached his eyes. Brian enjoyed control, enjoyed being watched, enjoyed knowing that rooms adjusted themselves around him. The others followed his lead easily, laughing too loudly, shoulders loose, already claiming space as their own. Sarah felt her stomach tighten the moment she saw them. She recognized the type. Brian's eyes tracked her as she approached, not with interest, but with evaluation, as if she were an object placed there for his amusement. His comments began casually remarks about her uniform, her smile, the way she walked. Each word landed softly but left a bruise. Sarah kept her head down, repeating the same quiet phrases she had practiced over the years. "Yes, sir. I'll be right back. Sorry about that." She told herself to endure to finish the shift to go home and lock the door behind her. The diner filled with an uneasy stillness. A trucker at the counter stared into his plate. An older couple sat frozen hands wrapped around mugs they no longer lifted. Everyone felt at that invisible boundary, where humor stopped being harmless and turned sharp. Brian leaned back in his booth, boots stretched into the aisle, watching Sarah navigate around him. He wanted a reaction. He wanted proof that he mattered. When it happened, it was almost nothing. Sarah's hand slipped as she reached to refill a glass. Water spilled across the table, splashing Brian's sleeve. She froze, breath caught in her chest, already apologizing before the words formed. Brian's laughter cut through the room. He stood slowly, picked up his mug, and without raising his voice poured hot coffee down onto Sarah's hand. The pain was immediate, searing, impossible to hide. Sarah gasped, biting down hard enough to taste blood, her body folding inward on instinct. The mug hit the table with a dull thud. No one moved. The silence was worse than the laughter. Brian watched her with calm satisfaction, as if proving a point only he understood. That was when the door opened again. Snow and wind swept inside, followed by a man who looked carved from the same winter that ruled the highway. Daniel Walker was 45 tall and broad, without excess, his posture straight, despite the weight he carried. He wore a dark brown leather jacket, thick and worn smooth at the seams, over a red and navy flannel shirt. Faded jeans clung to his legs, creased and silvered with age, tucked into heavy leather boots built for cold ground and long distances. A gray wool scarf rested around his neck, one end darkened by melting snow. His face was angular, framed by a short, neatly kept beard streaked with gray, his eyes deep-set and unreadable, shaped by years of watching danger arrive without warning. At his side sat Max, a full-grown German shepherd with a strong black and tan coat and intelligent, steady eyes. The dog moved with quiet discipline, sitting close to Daniel's leg muscles, relaxed but ready. Max was not young, not old, and every scar along his flank told a story of loyalty earned the hard way. He did not bark. He did not growl. He watched. Daniel took in the room in a single glance. Sarah hunched over her burned hand. Brian Holt standing too close, his smile fading. The frozen faces of people who had decided silence was safer than conscience. Daniel said nothing. He stepped fully inside, closed the door behind him, and let the quiet stretch. Max remained still, gaze locked on the men at the booth. Something shifted. Brian felt it before he understood it. The diner no longer belonged to him. Daniel removed his gloves, slowly placed them on the counter, and rested one hand against the gray scarf at his throat. His eyes never left Brian's face. There was no anger in them, no threat spoken aloud. Just recognition. The moment hung there unfinished, heavy, as the snow pressing against the windows. Snow pressed softly against the windows of the Montana diner, muting the highway beyond into a pale, restless blur. Daniel Walker remained where he stood, just inside the door, feeling the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever the present brushed too close to the past. The room was warm, but his fingers were cold beneath the worn leather jacket, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He had learned long ago that certain moments could pull him backward without warning, dragging old memories into places they did not belong. This was one of them. The imbalance of power, the silence of witnesses, the soundless question hanging in the air, who would stop it if anyone did at all. Max sat at his side, broad shoulders, squared tail, still amber eyes steady. The German shepherd was 8 years old now, his muzzle just beginning to gray, but his presence carried the same calm authority it always had. A long, faint scar ran along his right flank, visible beneath the thick black and tan coat. Daniel's gaze drifted there without thinking, his mind slipping back to a desert night years earlier, when the world had burned and shattered in the same breath. They had been pinned down, the air vibrating with gunfire, visibility reduced to smoke and panic. Daniel remembered going down hard, the shock of the ground slamming into his ribs, the taste of dust and blood. He remembered Max charging without hesitation, trained instinct, married to something deeper, something earned through trust. The dog had dragged him behind cover teeth, clenched on Daniel's vest, ignoring the shrapnel that tore into his side. Max had saved his life that night. Daniel had survived. Others had not. That was the part that never loosened its grip. In the diner, Sarah Mitchell stood by the counter, now cradling her burned hand, her shoulders drawn inward, as if she were trying to disappear into herself. Up close, Daniel could see the fine tremor running through her arms, the way her jaw tightened to keep emotion contained. She was small-framed, her uniform hanging a bit loose on her brown hair, escaping its tie in soft strands that clung to her cheek. Her eyes avoided the room, fixed on nothing in particular, because meeting anyone's gaze felt like risk. Daniel recognized that look too. It was the look of someone who had learned that attention could turn dangerous without warning. Brian Holt had resumed his seat, but his body remained angled toward Daniel, his posture defensive now, as if asserting space by habit. Up close, Brian's confidence showed its cracks. His broad frame and squared shoulders spoke of strength, but his eyes flicked too often, checking reactions, measuring the room. Authority had shaped him, fed him, taught him that pushing boundaries carried little consequence. Daniel had seen men like him before in uniforms, and without them. The setting changed. The pattern did not. Daniel felt the familiar internal conflict begin its slow, grinding turn. He had promised himself a quiet life after leaving the service, a cabin beyond the tree line, a wood stove long mornings without orders or alarms. He had told himself he was done intervening, done carrying the weight of outcomes he could not control. Silence was safer. Silence did not follow you home at night. Yet silence had its own cost, one he paid for in restless sleep and sudden waking breaths. Max shifted slightly, sensing the tension through Daniel's leg. The dog leaned into him just enough to remind him of solid ground. Max knew Daniel's nightmares better than anyone. He knew the sharp intake of breath that came before memories took shape. The way Daniel's hand would curl unconsciously when guilt crept in. Max never flinched. He stayed. That loyalty had kept Daniel tethered to the present more times than he could count. Daniel's thoughts drifted unbidden to the cabin where they lived. It sat alone beyond the edge of town timber walls, darkened by years of snow and sun. Inside the space was spare, but orderly, shaped by habit and necessity. A photograph rested on the shelf above the table faces of men who never made it home. Daniel rarely looked at it directly, but he never moved it either. The cabin was his retreat, his penance, his reminder. He had built it to escape the world, not to re-enter it. Across the diner, Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes met Daniel's for a brief second, then flicked away, uncertain. There was no plea in them, no expectation. That somehow made it worse. Daniel felt something tighten behind his ribs. He remembered villagers who never asked for help because they had learned it rarely came. He remembered telling himself more than once that he could not save everyone. The truth was simpler and harder. Sometimes he had chosen not to try. Brian Holt laughed, a short, sharp sound meant to reclaim control. He said something Daniel didn't quite hear, but the tone was enough. Mockery dressed as confidence. Daniel felt his jaw set. He ran his thumb along the edge of the gray wool scarf, grounding himself in the texture. Intervening would mean consequences. Attention. Possibly violence. Doing nothing would mean carrying this moment the way he carried so many others. Max rose smoothly to his feet, not as a threat, not as a challenge, but as presence. The movement was small, controlled, yet it shifted the air in the room. Daniel exhaled slowly. He understood then that the choice had already been made long before he stepped into the diner. Some lines once crossed demanded response, not because it would fix everything, but because failing to respond would fracture something that could not be repaired. Daniel did not speak yet. He did not move toward Brian Holt or Sarah Mitchell. He simply stood there, anchored by the weight of memory and the quiet strength at his side, feeling the moment stretch thin, Outside, the snow continued to fall indifferent and endless as the past and present pressed together inside a small Montana diner. Snow rattled softly against the diner windows, the wind pressing low and steady, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Daniel Walker finally spoke, and the sound of his voice cut through the room with a calm that felt almost unnatural. It was low, deliberate, and stripped of emotion, the kind of voice that had once carried orders across chaos and gunfire. He did not raise it. He did not sharpen it. He simply asked the men to stop, not as a plea, not as a threat, as a boundary. The words were plain, measured, and final, and for a heartbeat, the diner seemed to tilt around them. Officer Brian Holt reacted instantly, his chair scraping back as he stood. Up close, his height and breadth were meant to intimidate, his chest puffed forward, his jaw set in practiced authority. The stubble along his face darkened as his lips curled, anger flaring hot and fast. He stepped toward Daniel, pointing a finger, as if it were a weapon of its own, accusing him of interfering, of causing a disturbance, of forgetting his place. Brian's voice rose, carrying the weight of his badge, even without the metal visible. He spoke of arrests, of charges, of consequences, his words tumbling over one another as control began to slip through his fingers. Daniel did not move. He stood tall in his worn leather jacket boots, planted firmly on the diner's scuffed floor, the gray scarf resting unmoving against his chest. His angular face remained composed, eyes steady and unblinking as they held Brian's gaze. Years of discipline had taught him how to absorb aggression without mirroring it, how to let rage burn itself out against silence. Inside his pulse quickened a familiar rhythm, tapping at old instincts, but he kept his hands open, visible, empty. Violence would only feed the narrative Brian wanted. Daniel refused to give him that. At Daniel's side, Max rose smoothly to his feet. The German shepherd did not bare his teeth or make a sound. His posture alone spoke volumes, head level, ears, forward weight balanced and ready. The scar along his flank stretched subtly as muscle tightened beneath thick fur. At 8 years old, Max carried himself with the quiet confidence of experience, his amber eyes locked on Brian Holt, assessing distance and movement with unbroken focus. The room felt smaller with him standing there, the air charged by a presence that promised response if lines were crossed. Sarah Mitchell watched from behind the counter, her uninjured hand clenched against the edge of the laminate surface. The burn on her other hand throbbed, but the deeper ache sat in her chest, a tightness born of fear and disbelief. She had expected the man in the leather jacket to say nothing, to walk past her pain, the way so many others had. Seeing him stand there now, unyielding and calm, unsettled her. She was slim and pale beneath the diner lights, her shoulders still hunched defensively, but something inside her stirred, cautious and fragile. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to hope that silence might not win. Brian Holt's attention flicked briefly to Max, then back to Daniel. The dog's stillness unnerved him. Brian took another step forward, invading space, attempting to reassert dominance through proximity. He threatened arrest again, louder this time, his voice edged with desperation rather than authority. One of the officers behind him shifted uneasily, a man in his early 30s, with a narrower build and a hesitant expression. He glanced around the diner at the rigid patrons, at the phones beginning to appear in trembling hands. A trucker at the counter lifted his phone fingers, clumsy but determined. A middle-aged woman near the window followed suit, her mouth pressed into a thin line of resolve. The red glow of recording screens punctured the dim diner light, silent witnesses forming in real time. Daniel noticed them without turning his head. He felt the weight of scrutiny settle over the room, not as threat, but as accountability. Brian noticed too, and the realization struck him like a slap. His posture wavered. Daniel spoke again, just one sentence, reminding Brian that the world was watching now. His tone remained even devoid of accusation. He did not mention the coffee, the burn, or the humiliation. He did not need to. The truth had already taken shape around them. Brian's face flushed his eyes, darting to the phones, to his fellow officers, to Max's unwavering stare. The authority he wielded so comfortably in isolation began to fracture under the weight of public gaze. Max remained motionless, his breathing slow, and controlled a living line drawn between escalation and restraint. Daniel could feel the tension radiating from the dog through the thin space between them, a shared readiness that did not require words. Years ago, in a different place, Max had waited for a single signal to act. Tonight, that signal did not come. Daniel trusted Max, and Max trusted him, and that trust held them both steady. The diner hummed with a low collective anticipation. No one spoke. No one sat. Brian Holt's voice faltered his threats, trailing off into frustrated silence, his hands clenched, then loosened, uncertainty flashing across his face. Daniel stood firm, neither advancing nor retreating, a quiet wall of resolve that refused to be moved. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent to the standoff unfolding within. Inside, the line between power and accountability had been drawn, and everyone in the room felt it. The moment stretched on heavy and unresolved as the silence deepened, and the promise of justice hovered close enough to touch, but not yet claimed. Snow drifted more slowly now, thick flakes settling against the diner windows, as if the storm itself had begun to listen. The silence inside the diner deepened, no longer sharp with threat, but heavy with something closer to revelation. Daniel Walker felt it in the set of his shoulders, in the way Max's breathing slowed beside him. The moment had shifted. He had learned to recognize that shift years ago, back when truth surfaced not through force, but through recognition. It came from the counter. An older man had been sitting there quietly, all along his back, slightly curved hands, wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. Henry Caldwell, late 60s, weathered and lean, wore a wool cap pulled low over thinning gray hair. His face was deeply lined eyes, sharp beneath bushy brows, the kind of eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize patterns when they reappeared. Henry leaned forward, squinting toward Daniel's wrist where the sleeve of the leather jacket had ridden up slightly. He inhaled slowly, then let out a quiet breath. "That's a unit mark," he murmured, not loudly but clearly enough for those closest to hear. His voice carried the gravel of age and certainty. "I've seen that before." Henry had served decades earlier, not in the same wars, not in the same places, but service left its imprint regardless of era. He knew the language of symbols etched into skin, the ones not meant for display. Daniel felt the gaze on his forearm and gently tugged his sleeve down, not out of shame but habit. The whisper spread faster than sound should have allowed. Heads turned, eyes narrowed with new understanding. Phones lifted higher. The narrative Brian Holt had tried to maintain began to crumble, replaced by something more dangerous to him than confrontation context. Brian felt it immediately. His jaw tightened, nostrils flaring as his attention snapped from Daniel to the onlookers. Authority thrived in isolation. Exposure stripped it bare. One of the officers standing behind Brian shifted his weight again. Officer Tyler Reed, early 30s, slimmer build, sandy hair, cropped short, had been quiet since entering the diner. His posture lacked the casual arrogance of the others. Tyler's eyes darted between Brian, Daniel, and the phones, now recording every angle. He swallowed hard. Tyler had joined the force believing in structure, in order, in the idea that the badge meant protection. Watching Brian, now watching the room turn, something inside him faltered. Brian Holt sensed it. Control had always been his currency, and he was spending it fast. He raised his voice again, but it no longer carried the same confidence. His words sounded rehearsed, defensive, too sharp. Daniel saw the shift clearly. Brian was no longer managing the room. He was reacting to it. Sarah Mitchell stood frozen for a long moment, listening as the attention drifted away from her burned hand and toward Daniel's past. She had not expected that. She had expected the focus to remain on authority, on threats, on consequences she would be forced to bear. The idea that the man who had stepped in carried his own history of service unsettled her in a different way. It made the moment feel larger than her pain, yet also strangely safer. Her heart pounded. She could feel it in her throat, in the tremble running through her fingers. Speaking meant exposure. Speaking meant risk. But silence, she realized, had already cost her too much. Sarah straightened slightly, her slim frame still tense, but no longer folded inward. Her light brown hair had fallen loose from its tie, framing a face pale with fear and resolve. She took a breath that felt too big for her chest. "It wasn't an accident," she said. Her voice shook, but it did not break. The sound cut through the diner with a clarity that surprised even her. Brian's head snapped toward her. Daniel felt Max shift subtly, the dog's body angling toward Sarah without any command. Sarah swallowed and continued, her words coming faster now, carried by adrenaline and long-suppressed anger. She described the comments, the laughter, the way Brian had watched her struggle. She described the coffee, the heat, the humiliation. Each sentence steadied her further. She did not embellish. She did not accuse beyond the truth. She simply told what happened. The room listened. No one interrupted. Phones remained raised. Tyler Reed stared at the floor, his shoulders slumping as if a weight had finally found its place. Brian Holt's face flushed, deeper anger and panic colliding in his eyes. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Words, once his weapon, failed him now. Max moved, then slow and deliberate. He stepped away from Daniel and walked toward Sarah, his paws silent on the worn tile. He stopped beside her and sat, tall and steady, his presence a quiet shield. The German Shepherd did not touch her, did not crowd her. He simply stayed. Sarah felt the warmth at her side, felt the steadiness radiating from the animal, and something inside her unclenched. She rested her uninjured hand lightly against the counter, grounding herself. Daniel watched the scene unfold with a calm shaped by long experience. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a solemn recognition that truth once spoken carried its own momentum. He met Henry Caldwell's gaze briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Henry gave a single nod. Tyler Reed finally looked up, his expression tight with conflict, but his eyes no longer avoided the truth playing out in front of him. Brian Holt took a step back. It was small, almost imperceptible, but everyone saw it. The power dynamic shifted completely. He was no longer the center. He was a man standing in the consequences of his choices. Outside, the snow continued its patient descent. Inside, the truth had surfaced, undeniable and exposed. Daniel remained still, Max seated protectively near Sarah, as the room absorbed the weight of what could no longer be hidden. Morning broke slowly over Montana, the storm spent, leaving the world hushed beneath a clean white sky, and the kind of cold that sharpened thought. The diner looked smaller in daylight, its windows clear now, the yellow glow replaced by pale winter sun. Word traveled fast in a town like this. By mid-morning, the videos recorded the night before had found their way beyond the county line, carrying voices and images that could not be explained away. An internal review was opened before noon. Brian Holt was placed on administrative leave, his badge and firearm collected with procedural calm that felt to him like a public unmasking. When he walked out of the station, his shoulders were still broad, his jaw still set, but the certainty he had worn so comfortably was gone. He avoided the eyes of those who watched him pass, his anger collapsing inward into something quieter and more dangerous realization. Daniel Walker did not stay to witness any of it. He left town early before the roads fully cleared, before anyone could turn him into a symbol he never wanted to be. He paid for his coffee at the diner, with exact change, nodding once to Henry Caldwell at the counter, who returned the gesture without words. Daniel offered no explanations, no statements. His angular face was calm, his gray scarf wrapped neatly at his throat, the worn brown leather jacket creasing as he pulled it closed. Max followed at his heel, the German shepherd's stride, easy confident, as if the world made sense again. They stepped back into the cold, together snow, crunching beneath boots and paws, and drove away without looking back. Sarah Mitchell watched the truck disappear from the window, her breath fogging the glass. She stood straighter now, her posture no longer folded inward, her movements slower but surer. The burn on her hand had been treated wrapped carefully, the pain dulled, but present a reminder rather than a wound. She was still slim, still pale beneath the diner lights, her light brown hair loose around her shoulders for once, not tied back in tight defense. When customers spoke to her now, their voices carried something different. Not pity, respect. She met their eyes, and found that she could hold their gaze without flinching. The days that followed were not easy. Questions came, statements were taken. Sarah told her story more than once, each time steadier, each time feeling the weight lift just a little. She learned that courage did not erase fear. It simply refused to let fear decide everything. When she walked home after her shifts, the cold no longer felt like an enemy. It felt honest. She began to imagine a life shaped by choice, rather than endurance, a future that did not require silence as payment for safety. Beyond town, Daniel guided his truck along the narrow road toward the cabin, the forest closing in tall pines heavy with snow. The cabin emerged as it always did, modest and unassuming, its timber walls dark against the white ground. Inside, the air was still the quiet, deep, and welcoming. Daniel set his gloves on the table, hung the leather jacket by the door, and knelt briefly to rest his forehead against Max's, a gesture of thanks that required no words. Max's tail thumped once, solid and sure. The cabin held Daniel's life in simple shapes: the wood stove, the rough-hewn table, the photograph above the shelf. He looked at the photograph, this time really looked, tracing the familiar faces with his eyes. The guilt that had followed him for years did not vanish. It never did. But it shifted, settling into something he could carry without being crushed. He understood now that walking away from the uniform had not ended his responsibility to the world. It had simply changed its form. Later, as dusk settled over the forest, Daniel stepped outside with Max. The sky burned briefly with color before fading to blue, the snow reflecting the last light. He breathed in the cold air, feeling it fill his lungs, steady and grounding. Max sat beside him, his black and tan coat stark against the white ground, ears angled toward distant sounds Daniel could not hear. Together they watched the forest settle into night. Daniel thought of Sarah Mitchell standing straighter in a place that had once shrunk her. He thought of Henry Caldwell's knowing eyes, of Tyler Reed's conflicted silence, of the moment when truth had tipped the balance without a single blow struck. He understood that justice did not always arrive with sirens or force. Sometimes it arrived quietly, carried by someone willing to stand still and refused to move. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled to life. Outside, the snow lay undisturbed. Daniel rested a hand on Max's head, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm. He had left the battlefield behind, but the line between right and wrong remained as clear as ever. In the deep quiet of the Montana winter, he accepted that his mission had never truly ended. It had simply come home. This story reminds us that miracles do not always arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes they arrive quietly through one person who refuses to look away. God often works through ordinary moments, placing us exactly where we are needed, asking only for courage and compassion. Daniel did not raise his fists or his voice, he simply stood firm, and that was enough to let truth rise. In our daily lives, we are all given moments like this at work, in public online moments, where silence is easier, but love demands action. When we choose to stand for what is right, even in small ways, we become part of something greater than ourselves. That is how faith becomes visible. That is how healing begins. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage and grace. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and guide your steps wherever you are watching from.